One of the most important lessons that I have learned throughout my life so far is that things are usually, if not always, more complicated than what they may seem at first glance. And today I want to make this point on the issue of economic value by looking at the commentary that the popular YouTuber Unlearning Economics has done on this very same issue. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on the labor theory of value, but I am not going to limit myself to just discussing this theory. But before going into detail into Unlearning Economics arguments and my own counter-arguments, I would like to give some overall thoughts that I have on this video, highlighting both the positive things and the not so positive things about it. The first thing that I would like to say is that Unlearning Economics has clearly done a lot of research for this video, and he has studied the thoughts of some of the most important figures in these debates. He has also produced a really fun and engaging video that serves as a nice introduction to very complicated economic subjects, especially for people that are not very technical on these issues and that haven't studied these issues very in-depth. But not everything about Unlearning Economics video is good, and I would also like to say some things that I didn't really like about it. The first of which is that Unlearning Economics here is wanting to speak about too many issues at the same time, and this ends up making it so that he mixes concepts at some points in the video. He also is unclear as to what his arguments are at some points, and he's also unclear as to what the targets of his arguments really are. I also believe that Unlearning Economics at some points misrepresents some of the positions that he's arguing against. And at the same time, he's going to feature a very prominent lack of analytical depth on his discussion on some of these issues. That is also going to lead at some points to him either not representing fully some of the arguments and some of the debates, and also at some points this is going to lead him to make basically arguments from ignorance, where he will conflate his own ignorance or lack of analysis on some issue with a good reason to believe or to disbelieve a given proposition, right? And here we have to be clear as to whether we accept or reject a given proposition, or we are just agnostic about that proposition. For example, Unlearning Economics is going to say that the labor theory of value makes the unjustified claim and the assumption that labor is the only factor of production that creates value, but at the same time he's going to argue that other factors of production, such as constant capital, that is machinery, raw materials, tools, etc., those can also create economic value, but he's not going to give any good reasons as to why this is the case, other than his basic statement that he doesn't think of any good reason as to why this shouldn't be the case. So conflating ignorance with a good reason to accept or reject a proposition is something that I don't think is good argumentation, and this is something that he's going to do at some points in this video as well. So on the first section of his video, Unlearning Economics talks about the question of wealth creation, and I think that this is a really good starting point, since it is where most, if not all, of the theories on economic value originate from. And the first thing that he's going to say about this, and I believe that he is correct in here, is that the debate on wealth creation gives rise to the further debate on what constitutes unproductive and productive labor. And here I agree with him also on the fact that unproductive labor is not necessarily wrong or unnecessary labor, since some of the most important forms of labor could in fact be unproductive. However, whereas Unlearning Economics in this section is going to present a lot of fun anecdotes and historical context on these questions, he's really not going to present a really cohesive account on what constitutes wealth, what wealth creation entails, and what the distinction between productive and unproductive labor really is. Unlearning Economics is also not going to establish a strong connection between these different subjects in order to build a solid question from which to begin to speak about economic value and the different theories that try to answer such question. And since he doesn't do this, I would like to give this particular connection myself by first noting that when we speak about wealth, what we are talking about is the mass of objects of social use that are available to a society at a given point in time. Therefore, what makes a society wealthy is having access to a lot of objects of social use, which may or may not be tangible, by the way. And depending on the historical context that you're looking at, the wealth of a given society can take one given social form or another. In capitalist societies, which are the main focus of our analysis, this wealth takes the form of a mass of commodities, where commodities are not only objects of social use, but they are also objects of exchange. That is, they are exchangeable objects that have therefore the property of having a worth, a quantitative worth, since in exchange all commodities get compared with one another in quantitative terms. And the question of economic value, which arises in the context of these societies, is basically trying to answer what the magnitude of this capitalist wealth is, as well as what the quantitative worth of the different components of this wealth really are. Therefore, the question that we're really trying to answer is that of the nature and quantitative worth of the components of the wealth of capitalist nations, and knowing that this is what we're trying to answer is going to help us better understand the different theories that we're going to look at, as well as to frame these debates in a better, more comprehensive light. Under this view, productive labor is therefore going to be the form of labor that creates new wealth, that is, the form of labor that creates more economic value. And unproductive labor is going to be the form of labor that may redistribute that wealth or may just protect the social institutions that keep that wealth alive, but it is not going to create any new wealth. It's not going to add any more economic value than the one that already exists. And since Unlearning Economics doesn't present a theory as to what productive and unproductive labor really entail, I would like to make it clear that I believe in the classical and Marxist account of these questions to be the most accurate and scientific one so far. And here I would like to recommend that you either read this book, which is a very popular book in the academic literature by Tonak and Shaikh, called Measuring the Wealth of Nations, where they discuss this particular issue of what is wealth creation, and what the difference between productive and unproductive labor is from this classical Marxist standpoint. And I would also recommend that you look at my own video on this particular subject, where I explain these questions more in depth. Here, Unlearning Economics makes the final point that the theories on economic value seem to have two sides to them. One that is more descriptive and scientific, and one that is more normative and ideological. And here, I agree with him on the fact that a lot of people seem to conflate these two sides of these theories, but I don't think that he's very clear as to whether he believes that the normative and ideological side is necessarily drawn from the descriptive and scientific side of these particular theories. And I particularly believe that these two sides are not necessarily connected to one another, and that when we are talking about theories of value, we should discuss them and their merits only on scientific grounds, and then, if anything, go to more ideological conversations. But first and foremost, we should do a descriptive and scientific account of these theories. In the next section, Unlearning Economics is going to begin by discussing some of the earlier and more primitive theories on economic value, which I think it's interesting, and I like it that he had included that historical context, but I'm not going to be focusing on these theories since they are not directly relevant to the theories of subjective value and the labor theory of value that I'm going to be discussing next. So focusing first on the subjective theory of value, Unlearning Economics makes the point that according to this theory, value is simply a measure of the satisfaction that consumers earn from the different objects of social use that exist in society and that get exchanged in capitalist societies. And he is also going to correctly point out that under this view, every labor that gets paid for, that is every form of labor for which there is a price, is considered to be productive labor, and the more that the laborer earns, the more productive that he or she is, and also the more valuable a thing is, the more or the higher its price is also going to be. And this value again is going to be linked, is going to be tied back to the satisfaction that people earn from consuming those objects. Therefore, if people are willing to pay for any form of labor, that form of labor is productive, and if people are willing to pay for any given thing, and the more they want to pay for it, the better, then it is valuable. And the more they want to pay, the more valuable that it is. Unlearning Economics is then going to correctly point out that under this view, a lot of activities done by the government are considered to be unproductive, which gives rise to the bad reputation that government activities have under the neoclassical school of thought paradigm. He's then going to correctly explain also how the subjective theory of value gives rise to a specific theory on distribution, which is known as the marginal productivity theory of distribution, according to which every factor of production in capitalist societies gets paid exactly what its marginal product is. And Unlearning Economics is also going to correctly point out how this given theory of distribution can lead to the ideological conclusion that every factor of production gets paid fairly since they get paid in accordance to their productivity. However, I do not believe that this ideological conclusion is necessarily drawn from the descriptive part of the theory. Then Unlearning Economics is going to successfully criticize this theory on three main grounds. The first of which is that the theory makes an unrealistic assumption as to the homogeneity of the labor force as well as the interchangeability of the different workers within the pool of the laborers in a given workforce. He's also going to successfully criticize the theory on the grounds that it doesn't account for joint production in the case where people in a team are working towards a common goal, that is providing a given service or producing a given good, and he's also going to criticize the theory on the grounds that it is circular, since it's going to explain the payment received by the different factors of production by the marginal productivity of those factors of production, but at the same time the only way that it can measure, that it can account for this productivity is by looking at the payment received by those factors of production itself. So basically the theory would say that people who earn more are more productive, but the reason why they are more productive is because they earn more, which is basically circular reasoning. And whereas I do agree with Unlearning Economics on these criticisms of marginal productivity theory, I do not think that this is a good reason as to why we should disbelieve the subjective theory of value. That is, Unlearning Economics is trying to critique the subjective theory of value, but what he's really critiquing here is the theory of distribution of the neoclassical economist. And I think that the subjective theory of value should be criticized on different grounds, not on the grounds of its distribution counterpart. Therefore, since the subjective theory of value focuses more on consumption and tries to explain the quantitative worth of the different components of capitalist wealth according to the satisfaction to the utilities that consumers derive from these particular objects of social use, then this criticism should be focused more on the neoclassical concepts of utilities, preferences, and so on and so forth, rather than on the critique of its distribution theory. And as a behavioral economist, Unlearning Economics should be able to criticize successfully consumer behavior theory in the neoclassical school of economic thinking, as well as to criticize these concepts of preference, of utility functions, and so on and so forth. However, he doesn't do this, and instead he leaves it very unclear as to what the reasons are why we should disbelieve in the subjective theory of value. Instead, he just proposed good criticisms for the neoclassical theory on distribution, which again is different from the subjective theory of value. But in case you are interested in the criticisms to the subjective theory of value and the concepts around consumer behavior that it proposes, I would recommend that you first look at this paper, which gives a good account as to why a lot of the ways in which the neoclassical economists try to test their given assumptions on consumer behavior are really very circular and really are not that scientifically valid. And I would also recommend that you read this other paper that makes a strong criticism of the entire corpus of the neoclassical theory of value and distribution. Now we turn to the section on the labor theory of value. On this subject, Unlearning Economics begins by saying that one of Marx's main goals with the labor theory of value was trying to explain the nature and sources of capitalist profits, and he is correct in pointing that out. He then is going to explain the labor theory of value on some very basic terms by noting that under this theory, variable capital, that is labor, is the only factor of production that creates value, and therefore the only one that can add more value to the total output than the one needed to reproduce itself. Constant capital, which is machinery, raw materials, tools, and other utensils, isn't value creating, therefore it isn't a factor of production that can add more value to the output than the one needed to produce and reproduce itself. The surplus generated by workers is then converted into what is known as the exploitation rate or the surplus value rate, which is simply the ratio of total surplus value to total variable capital employed in production. Let's take a look at how Unlearning Economics explains this theory.
According to Marx, we can think of the problem like this. Capitalists employ both labour and capital in the production process. Marx called capital itself constant capital, denoted by C. Constant capital cannot add more value in production than it is paid. If a capitalist buys a machine for £10,000, then the machine adds £10,000 of value in production over the course of its lifetime. Marx called labour variable capital, denoted by V. Variable capital can add more value in production than it is paid. This is what is unique about labour in a capitalist economy. It produces surplus value for capitalists. Workers may be paid £10,000 a year, but create £20,000, which means £10,000 in surplus value. Workers are exploited under capitalism to create surplus value for capitalists. The rate of exploitation can be expressed as surplus value S over variable capital V. The extra value produced by labourers for capitalists divided by the total value they produce.
The main problem that I have with this explanation is that Unlearning Economics isn't presenting the reasons that the believers in the labor theory of value give as to why labor is the only source of economic value. And this lack of analysis on Unlearning Economics' part is going to lead him to the erroneous conclusion that the labor theory of value simply takes as an assumption that labor is the only factor of production that creates value, and this is also going to lead him to his main criticism of the labor theory of value, which is to say that, well, if we take it that other factors of production can also create value, and we take it as an assumption since he isn't going to present the reasons as to why these other factors of production can't, then the labor theory of value gets completely invalidated. So what Unlearning Economics is doing here is basically saying that the labor theory of value is unjustified in assuming that labor is the only factor of production that creates value, but then he's going to assume, based on his ignorance, that it cannot be other way, that other factors of production can also create new value.
I'm going to ask what I hope is a disarmingly simple question. Why does only labour create value? This is an assumption which is treated as an irrefutable truth. But if constant capital, C, if you remember, creates surplus value, then the whole theory falls apart. I was recently at a London grammar gig in Crystal Palace. There were massive speakers which multiplied the volume of the band, probably by like 10 decibels or something. I don't know anything about music. You've got to give me a good reason these speakers did not generate surplus value. Without them, the gig would have been pretty quiet and nobody would have gone. The same is true of the band, of course, but why is labour special? Marx's theory of exploitation assumes that labour values underlie capitalism.
This is really his main charge against the labor theory of value. And since Unlearning Economics doesn't explain this, I would like to make the explanation myself as to why the labor theory of value postulates that labor is the only factor of production that creates value. Let's begin the argument with a premise on wealth in capitalist societies. And this premise basically states that one of the main characteristics of capitalist societies is the generalization of exchange between use values. Now, in these societies, wealth, as we were saying before, takes the form of a mass of commodities. We then add a couple of premises on exchange, first by noting that generalized exchange is a social process by which qualitatively distinct use values are quantitatively compared and equalized. And here you can imagine that 1 kilogram of corn, for example, can be exchanged for 0.5 kilograms of apples, for 7 kilograms of flour, etc. And the proportions with which commodities get exchanged are what we call their exchange values, right? And these can be expressed as their relative prices, since if one commodity, for example, costs $5 and another costs $5 as well, we can express the exchange value of one commodity as the equivalent of one unit of the other commodity, right? As a 1-to-1 proportion. And also notice that a commodity has as many exchange values as there are other commodities in the market, since every commodity is potentially exchangeable with every other commodity. We then note that the exchange values of commodities indicate that these commodities have an objective quantitative worth, which is a property that all commodities have in common, since in order for some quantum X of a commodity, let's say commodity A, to be worth the same as a quantum Y of another commodity, say commodity B, both commodities must first have the property of having such quantitative worth, which is the same as saying that in order for two trees, for example, to be the same height, they first both have to have the common shared property of having a height. We then turn to discussing about labor, and on this subject we add three premises. The first of which is that all use values have in common the property of being the product of concrete human labor, which is a direct and or indirect effort exerted by human beings to, with the use of tools and equipment, bring those use values about in the specific form required for their consumption. Then we notice that commodities are, however, something more than simple use values. That is, they are objects that have the property of having a quantitative worth. Therefore, it follows that the same social relations that endow the qualitatively different use values with the shared property of having a quantitative worth are also the same social relations that endow the labor that produces these commodities with the ability to create quantitative worth. And commodity producing labor, insofar as it creates quantitative worth, is qualitatively alike and quantitatively different, since different commodities require different amounts of labor to be produced. And this type of labor is what we call abstract labor, which is one of the natures of labor in capitalist societies. So there is the concrete nature of labor, and then there is the abstract nature of labor, which arises particularly from the generalization of exchange in these societies. Then we turn to discussing what value is, and as we were saying earlier, value is both the source and the immanent measure of the objective quantitative worth of commodities, and it is therefore a social, objective, quantifiable property that is common to all commodities. Then, abstract socially necessary labor time is the only objective, social, quantifiable property common to all commodities that at the same time has the ability to create quantitative worth. Therefore, our conclusion is that, given all of the premises that we have discussed, the abstract socially necessary labor time required for the production of a commodity is that commodity's value. So in light of this argument, we can clearly see how no other thing other than labor power can create value, which invalidates Unlearning economics' argument against the labor theory of value that we could just assume that other factors of production create value, and therefore this would invalidate the labor theory of value. We now know exactly why labor is the only source of value, and using this we can also say that, of course, having the speakers in the concert that Unlearning economics was giving us the example of will certainly add more value to the total concert, but it isn't just because the speakers create more value, but because the value of the speakers was transferred by the workers into the final value of the total product. If it wasn't for the workers, the speakers wouldn't do a thing, and this is true for all of the factors of production that are categorized as constant capital. And if you think about this carefully, you will notice how saying that the speakers create value is as nonsensical as saying that the Mona Lisa was created by the tools that Leonardo da Vinci used for its production rather than by Leonardo da Vinci himself. What we would say is that the Mona Lisa was produced by Leonardo da Vinci with the use of utensils, but we wouldn't say that the utensils are the ones that are causally responsible for creating the Mona Lisa, right? Even though they were necessary components of the creation of such painting. So far we were focusing on value, and now we should focus on surplus value, that is on the extra value generated in production. And here, if we first accept the argument that I presented earlier, it is clear that if labor is the only factor of production that creates value, it can only be the only factor of production that creates surplus value. So what Unlearning Economics is trying to criticize when he's criticizing the labor theory of value for not fully accounting for profits is really the idea that surplus value is the sole source of capitalist profits. So the question that we want to answer now is if surplus value is a good theory of profits, or if other factors of production can also explain profits, or at least some of the profits. And here, since Unlearning Economics doesn't present a good argument for why the labor theory of value cannot account for profits, or it cannot account for value in general, rather than his argument from ignorance that was of the form, well, I cannot think of any reason why other factors of production cannot create value, therefore I'm going to assume that they can, I'm going to present a better argument as to why maybe surplus value isn't a good theory of profits. For this argument, we can make a thought experiment where we theorize that a production process, let's say for pencils, can be fully mechanized in such a way that it no longer requires any direct labor time to produce pencils. And at the same time, we can assume that this production process yields the same level of profits than it did before the full mechanization of the production process. Let's say that this level of profits is X. Now we will see that surplus value in this particular production process is equal to 0, but that profits are now equal to X, where X was some positive number. Therefore, one could take this to be a counterexample to the theory that surplus value can explain capitalist profits, right? Since surplus value is 0, but the profits are now a positive number. The main problem with this thought experiment is that it is static and it doesn't really account for the dynamics of capitalist societies. And we can therefore see that, yes, machinery could indeed be able to sustain for a given amount of time the level of profits, but it didn't bring that level of profits to begin with, and this machinery has limited causal powers to change the level of profits in order to bring about a higher level of profits, right? And this is what we can call the causal powers argument, which is presented by Ian Wright in this article that I recommend that you read. Now, my interpretation of this argument is a little bit different, but I still think that it is very important to read Ian Wright's original statements on this matter. So the argument goes as follows. Machines can indeed do some stuff that humans do, but they can only do what they have been programmed to do, and this obviously has a very limited range of activities that this machinery can perform. Also, machines are not conscious. So the fact that they are not conscious and that they have a limited range of causal powers means that they cannot, for example, use the dynamic information of market economies to make significant changes in the level of profit just by themselves, right? Human labor is always involved in this production of new and higher levels of profit, and this is precisely why machineries do not explain profits in capitalist societies. Only human beings are capable of doing these things, even if we usually, or most of the time, or even all of the time, rely on machines in the labor process. And so in this thought example that I presented earlier, we could imagine that a production process that has direct human labor involved in it will at some point outcompete the process that doesn't have any human labor. Because again, yes, machinery could produce pencils, but it's going to be unaware of all of the opportunities of producing pencils, that they are maybe cheaper or more efficient in some way, and that can therefore lead to higher profits. And therefore, at some point, this production process, since it is not alive, as in it's not creative with the causal powers of human beings, it will at some point cease to exist, since other forms of production processes of pencils that do employ direct human labor will outcompete it. So this argument can basically be summarized in what, in very nice words that Ian Wright says, which are humans have universal causal powers, but machines have particular causal powers. And it is precisely this difference in the causal powers of humans and machines that imply that labor is the only factor of production that can create value and therefore surplus value, and also that profits are explained in a very nice manner by this theory of surplus value. We can make an analogy for the argument that I just made using a candle and a lighter. Now, we can see that I can take this particular lighter and use it to produce a flame with my own human labor. And now I can take this candle and use the flame that I just produced in order to light the candle. Now the candle here is like machinery. It has limited causal powers because it cannot create the flame to begin with and because it can only sustain the flame for a limited amount of time. So in this analogy, you can view human labor power, as an infinite candle that has the causal power to create the flame in the first place, and also that has the causal powers to keep this flame alive forever and to actually make it grow ever larger and larger. Therefore, the flame right now is explained by my own labor using tools, and it is being sustained by the candle. But the candle didn't produce the flame to begin with, and it's only going to be able to sustain it for a little amount of time. But now you may be thinking, and you are very correct in thinking this, that yes, maybe machinery today or at some point in the past wasn't intelligent enough for us to believe that it has causal powers that are the same as ours or even surpass our causal powers. But we are certainly moving towards a world where artificial intelligence in particular can indeed surpass our own causal powers. So what is the implication for the labor theory of value of this? Does it mean that we now have to say that the labor theory of value is invalid, or that we will have to say this at some point when this is true about artificial intelligence? Well, I would like to say 2 points on this. First is that we haven't reached this stage in history yet. Therefore, right now, the labor theory of value works just fine. And second, that once we do reach that point in history where artificial intelligence matches our causal powers or even surpasses them, then we would indeed have to add that labor to the total value of commodities, since we now have to contend with creatures that are basically very alike to us, and also that have causal powers that indeed surpass our own. But I don't think that this would invalidate the labor theory of value. It would just simply extend the labor theory of value, right? So we would still work with some form of labor theory of value even in that stage in history. The next argument that Unlearning Economics is going to make against the labor theory of value is that this theory is circular. And he's going to support this by claiming that there is no way of measuring socially necessary labor time other than with wages. Let's take a look at his argument.
But hold on a cotton-picking minute. We are coming back to the same problem we had with marginal productivity theory. We have no measure of the exchange value other than the market. Do people pay for it, and if so, how much? We also have no measure of the value of socially necessary labor time other than wages. We're back to the circularity of theories which attempt to explain prices via prices. For all you Steven Crowder fans out there, it's more than just circular logic. It's a tautology.
So what Unlearning Economics just did is give what I call the poor argument for the circularity of the labor theory of value. And this is a poor argument, first of all, because it is based on false premises, and second of all, because even if it were true, even if its premises were true, it wouldn't lead to the conclusion that the labor theory of value is circular. So let's take a look at how Unlearning Economics is presenting this idea. First, he says that the socially necessary labor time required to produce commodities is unobservable and it is immeasurable. At some points, he even calls it mystical. However, wages are indeed observable and they are measurable. So what he claims is that what the people who want to test the empirical validity of the labor theory of value do is take wages and use them in order to estimate or to say that this measure of wages is the same, is the equivalent of the measure of socially necessary labor time. And this, according to him, is circular reasoning. It's correlating prices with prices, since those wages are then going to explain the different proportions with which commodities exchange in market economies. Now, what is the problem with this account? The first thing is that it is false. It is false because it is not true that wages are the only measure of socially necessary labor time that we can find. And you can see this by the basic premise that socially necessary labor time is measured in hours and wages are measured in currency units per hour or per month or per week or however you want to measure it. So we are wanting to measure exactly the amount of hours necessary to produce commodities. And there is data available for this in some countries using some economic methodologies. For example, some input-output tables provide us with the necessary data to calculate, to compute the actual labor time that is required to produce a commodity without having to estimate it via wages. But even if this were true, it wouldn't mean that the labor theory of value is circular, since we're not trying to explain the ratios with which commodities exchange in the market by looking at those ratios themselves, which would be circular. We're looking at a different thing. And actually, I would argue that taking wages as a proxy for socially necessary labor time is a valid procedure to make in some empirical studies. Now, not all of the empirical studies on the labor theory of value do this. In fact, only some of them do, especially the ones that look at the cross-sectional correlations of values and prices. But I think that this is, and many economists in this tradition believe this as well, that taking wages as a proxy for socially necessary labor time is completely valid. And if you actually do this same correlation without taking wages as a proxy of socially necessary labor time, that is measuring only the labor times required for production, you still get the very same high correlations that we're going to be looking at next when Unlearning Economics is going to criticize the empirical evidence. And to make an analogy that makes it clear why wages can be indeed a good proxy for the socially necessary labor time required to produce commodities, we can look at a similar, but in a different field, at a similar procedure that is used by researchers who are trying to study the relationship between the general intelligence of people and their performance in other tests, let's say the SAT, and also on their college GPA, for example. Obviously, intelligence is a very hard thing to measure. It has many potential measures, but IQ is one of them. And IQ actually is just a test that people take, and depending on the score that they receive, they will have a higher or a lower IQ. So one could say that the studies that use IQ as a proxy for general intelligence in order to study the relationship between intelligence and scores in the SAT or college GPA, you could say that this is circular, but it wouldn't make any sense. And in fact, it doesn't make any sense, which is why in the empirical literature on intelligence and the performance in college, this is taken to be good evidence in favor of the idea that people who are more intelligent will generally, on average, get better scores. And again, you could say that this is circular because they are in the end just correlating test scores with test scores, right? Just how Unlearning Economics was saying that the labor theory of value simply correlates prices with prices. But again, this is no problem because what we are doing here is taking a proxy variable. And in empirical research, proxy variables are taken for many things, such as, for example, IQ and intelligence. And actually, a good proxy variable will just be a variable that it's correlated with the thing that it's proxying. So in our case, wages are indeed correlated with socially necessary labor time, so we do not have any reason to believe why wages wouldn't be a good proxy variable for this socially necessary labor time. And since Unlearning Economics' argument for the circularity of the labor theory of value is quite poor and quite weak, I would like to make myself a stronger argument in favor of this position that I think will make it clear as to why the labor theory of value is in the end not circular. So this argument that is very comprehensively presented in this book by Spanish economist Juan Ramón Rayo, which I do not believe it's translated into English, but in case it is at some point, I will also link it to you. This argument basically says that there isn't a good way for Marxists to take concrete labors and turn them into abstract labor times without falling into some form of a circular procedure or without falling into some kind of a nonsensical procedure. And this argument, that could be indeed a good argument for the circularity of the labor theory of value, is the following. So the labor theory of value proposes that the theoretical relative prices determined by the labor values are going to be the ones that explain the actual market prices. And these theoretical relative prices have to have some tie to a measure of abstract labor time. However, this abstract labor time is not directly observed in the data because in the data we only observe concrete labor times. So we have to use some form of a conversion rate in order to turn the concrete labor times into the abstract labor times, right? And a circular way of doing this could be to use the actual relative prices in order to make this transformation. And what is exactly a circular procedure? For example, let's say that you take that commodity I, okay, some example of a commodity, is twice as expensive as the average. And therefore you conclude for that the abstract socially necessary labor time required to produce a commodity is going to be the concrete labor time required to produce that commodity times 2, since it is twice as expensive in the market. And then you use that abstract socially necessary labor time to derive the theoretical price that is going to explain the actual market price of commodity I. In this case, we would indeed say that there is a circular reasoning problem occurring in this procedure. However, this argument is also not a good argument, although it is stronger than the one presented by Unlearning Economics, because of the following reasons. So the first thing is that it is based on the false premise that Marxists use relative prices to explain this conversion from concrete to abstract labor time, and then use that abstract labor time to explain again the relative prices. And this is not true. However, there is a procedure that is used in many empirical papers that instead of looking at the relative prices of commodities, they look at the relative wages of the producers of those commodities. And there are two ways of doing this. One where the conversion rate is the ratio of the industry-specific wage to the minimum wage in the economy, or there's also the procedure where you take the ratio of the industry-specific wage to the average wage in the economy. And that is what you use as a conversion rate to turn concrete labor times into abstract labor times. However, one thing that is important to keep in mind is that this procedure is actually not necessary. And there is a recent empirical paper that basically shows that this is the case, because it takes different ways of doing this conversion from concrete to abstract labor times, and it shows that the procedure where you do not make any conversion is basically very equivalent to the others insofar as the results, the empirical results, are pretty much the same, and they still show very high correlations and very small deviations between the theoretical labor value determined prices and the actual market prices. And again, we could argue whether wages are a good proxy in this case for skill and intensity, but in reality we wouldn't be falling into a circular reasoning problem. The main issue that I have with this way of looking at this issue is that the assumption that is made by the strong circular criticism is that it is economists that convert concrete labor times into abstract labor times, when in reality this is not a thing that economists do. This is something that capital itself does. And this is basically a social process, right? So economists simply take what is already an abstract product, and then they can indeed use some statistical tools, such as, for example, the conversion rates, to make it into a thing that we may think it's more relevant for empirical analysis or less relevant. But in reality, the abstract nature of labor time in capitalist societies comes from the social relations of capitalist economies themselves, right? And capital is really what converts these concrete labor times into abstract labor times. It's what gives rise to the dual nature of labor that is also arising from the dual nature of commodities itself, right? Commodities are both use values and exchange values at the same time. So it also is true that the labor that produces them is at the same time concrete and has this abstract potential, right? And this abstract potential, as we were saying in the argument that I presented earlier for the labor theory of value, this is the abstract potential. It's basically the one that explains that is the creator of this quantitative worth of commodities. And under this view, we could make an analogy of capital as a grinding machine that takes concrete forms of labor and turns them, squeezes them and breaks them apart and turns them into a homogeneous paste of labor that is measurable in hours, in a very similar way to how an actual grinding machine, a meat grinding machine, will take different pieces of meat from different animals that are genetically unique, so they are concrete, and this machine will turn all of those concrete pieces of meat from concrete animals that are genetically unique and will turn them into a homogeneous paste of meat that can be measured in kilograms, for example. So it is capital itself that gives rise to this property of labor of being abstract. And the more that you aggregate this labor, the more abstract that your measure of labor time is going to get. This is how actually labor values are calculated in practice. So you're not just looking at the direct labor employed in the production of one particular commodity, but also the indirect labor, that is the labor that goes into the production of the commodities that are used up in the production of a particular commodity, and you are therefore aggregating a lot of workers' labor, and since every single worker has the potential for creating this abstract labor time, but you cannot really measure it by any single worker, when you aggregate all of them, you will get a good measure, as is done in the empirical studies, you will get a good measure of abstract socially necessary labor time. This is similar and analogous to how if you look at a single neuron in your brain, you won't see consciousness, but every neuron has the potential of creating consciousness. And if you look at a collection of neurons within your brain acting together in order to produce this brain phenomena, you will at some point get to consciousness. And this is basically an equivalent procedure that is done in the case of abstract socially necessary labor time. Any single individual working has the potential of being part of this abstract socially necessary labor time, but it's not itself the abstract socially necessary labor time. But if you gather all of the producers of a given commodity type, and you also gather together all of the producers of the commodities that go into that particular commodity type's production, you will get indeed a good measure of abstract socially necessary labor time without actually needing to do any conversion rates or any other type of procedure. The next point that Unlearning Economics is going to make in this section is a misrepresentation of the Marxist theory of exploitation that takes the following form.
Marx's theory of exploitation assumes that labor values underlie capitalism. The fact that labor is not paid its true value underlies the charge of exploitation of workers. As David Ellerman puts it, this appeal to value can feel kind of mystical.
So according to Unlearning Economics, the charge of exploitation in Marx's theory is that labor doesn't get paid its true value. And this is incorrect, because according to Unlearning Economics representation, exploitation arises from exchange instead of it arising from production. And in Marx's actual theory, exploitation arises from production. That is, from the production of the surplus value of a surplus that workers have to produce above and beyond what is necessary for their own reproduction. Therefore, workers are not exploited because they are not paid their true value. They are exploited because they are forced to work more than what they actually need to work in order to reproduce themselves. Marx's theory of exploitation obviously accounts for the fact that there could be exploitation arising from unequal exchange. But the main thrust of the argument is that exploitation, even in a very ideal capitalist society where all commodities exchange at their values, must still exist. There must still be exploitation, since for the surplus of capitalist societies to be generated, there must be extra labor performed in production. So when Unlearning Economics gives the David Ellerman example of using any other commodity as a source of value and then trying to explain exploitation by an unequal exchange of that commodity with other commodities, he is wrong on two grounds. First, on the ground that exploitation does not actually arise from exchange, when he is claiming that it does, and the second is that no other commodity can be the source of value as we just presented earlier. Now, Unlearning Economics is making this conclusion precisely because of his lack of analytical depth, precisely because he didn't even bother to research why we believe that labor is the only source of value, which led him to the erroneous conclusion that you could just simply assume other commodities to be the source of value and everything would be equivalent. And it is true that some Marxists do believe that exploitation arises from unequal exchange, and there are certainly Marxists that believe in these misrepresentations of the theory. But this doesn't justify Unlearning Economics presenting this criticism as if it were an actual criticism of the actual theory of exploitation presented by Marx and defended by most of the academic Marxist economists. Really, the main charge against the labor theory of value that Unlearning Economics is doing in this section is just assuming that the labor theory of value takes as an unjustified assumption that labor is the only source of value. But if he had actually done the research, he would understand why this cannot be the case. And instead of just presenting this idea as an assumption, as an unjustified assumption, he could at least contend with the actual argument, even if he doesn't agree that this argument is correct. But he could at least present it and then try to argue against it. Instead, he's choosing to argue against a straw man. But this isn't the last thing that Unlearning Economics has to say against the labor theory of value, since in his next section he presents the transformation problem and concludes from this problem that there is no possible way in which Marxists can derive prices from labor values. Let's take a look.
There are two avenues we can go down if we want to treat the labor theory of value as a scientific theory. The first is to try and use it to explain where prices come from. Even if we can't always predict every individual price, we may be able to get at important tendencies. But getting from values to prices and back again is far from easy.
If they're able to trick you into thinking they come, if you ask them a basic question like, oh, well, like, what do you think about like the transformation problem? They'll just give you like a dead stare.
Transformation problem. All right, let's help Destiny out here. What is the transformation problem? Well, value itself is not an observable phenomenon. When we work out the maths of the labor theory of value, we get answers in terms of value, rather than in terms of observables like prices, profit, or output. But if we're going to test the theory in the real world, we're going to need things we can actually measure. Transforming immeasurable values into measurable prices is the problem we face. The transformation problem. Let's learn a little bit more about this. I'm going to use the simplest example I could find, which actually came from Wikipedia. If you don't fully get it, then don't worry too much, just move on to the next section. The idea is more about the mismatch between prices and values than it is about the specific mathematical example.
Imagine an economy of hunters where workers can hunt either deer or beavers. The amount of labour required to hunt a deer is 2 hours, and the amount required to hunt a beaver is 1 hour. In this case, it's clear that 1 deer will exchange for 2 beavers. 1 deer takes 2 hours to hunt. 2 hours of hunting could instead get you 2 beavers. If the price of a deer were put up to 3 beavers, it would effectively cost 3 hours of labour. The buyer could just switch to hunting deer and put in 2 hours to get one. This holds for any values of the labour time required to hunt deer and beavers. Generally, the price of a deer will be LD over LB, where LD is the labour required to hunt deer and LB is the labour required to hunt beavers. Prices are determined solely by the labour embodied in the two foods, so the labour theory of value seems to predict prices in this simple example. Suppose that to catch deer or beavers you also need arrows. Now the cost of catching a deer is given by PD, which is equal to this nasty looking expression. The first part on the right shows LD, again the labour required for hunting deers, multiplied by W, the wage paid to labour. The next part concerns the arrows. AD is the number of arrows required, multiplied by PA, the price of each arrow, multiplied further by 1 plus R, which accounts for the return R paid to the arrow owner, a capitalist of sorts. Arrows are also produced by labour, which takes LA hours multiplied by the same wage W. If we put this expression for the price of arrows into the one for the price of deer, we get this. The one for beavers would look similar, just with all the D's replaced with B's. We have the competitive market price of deer and of beavers. Competitive market prices are just equal to costs. But let's return to the labour theory of value. What is the labour time embodied in each food? We can call this ED. Well, for deer, it is simple. The labour put into hunting the deer LD plus the labour from the arrows times the number of arrows. If you've not followed so far, just note this. Clearly, this embodied labour time is not the same expression as the one for price. ED and PD will be equal only in special cases like the one earlier. The relative price ratio of deer and beavers is PD over PB. Again, this is very different to the ratios of embodied labour time ED over EB. Labour value doesn't map onto prices in a capitalist economy. There is a wedge between the two which is, ironically, introduced by capital itself. Ironic because Marx was specifically concerned with understanding capitalism.
So, Unlearning Economics' account of the transformation problem is both wrong and at the same time leads him to the wrong conclusion that it is profits that explain the mismatch between labor values and prices and that mean that the entire system is mathematically unsolvable. Let's first analyze what the argument that Unlearning Economics is presenting us really is. So, according to him, the transformation problem is the problem of transforming immeasurable values into measurable prices. And he says that, yes, he first presents a simple exchange economy where there is no capitalist relations of production, and he shows that in this very basic economy, it is true that prices are proportional to labor values. That is, the theoretical prices determined by labor values are indeed proportional to the labor values themselves. And whereas this conclusion is very trivially true for this simple exchange economy, he then presents a capitalist economy where there is indirect labor times and where there is economic profits, and he basically shows mathematically that the labor values in this economy will not be proportional to the competitive prices, right? And this expression is basically given by this very simple equation where you can see that there is no proportionality between the prices and the labor values. He concludes from this, therefore, that the system is mathematically unsolvable and that it is the introduction of profits that, ironically, has produced this result, since Marx was trying to actually explain capitalist profits, right? So it is ironic that the capitalist profits themselves will be the ones that render his system unsolvable. Unlearning Economics' interpretation is, however, mistaken. The first reason is that the transformation problem is not the problem of transforming values into prices. It is actually the problem of transforming one form of value, which is direct prices, into a more analytically advanced one, which is known as prices of production. Also, the transformation problem has nothing to do with the potential measurability of prices or labor values. And this is true because both of these are measurable, as we explained in the previous section. The final point that he makes about capitalist profits being the source of the transformation problem is also mistaken, since capitalist profits are not actually the source of price-value deviations. The source is unequal organic compositions of capital between industries, right? And the composition of capital, for those of you who may not know this, is simply the ratio of the constant capital employed in production to the variable capital employed in production. And if these organic compositions of capital are different across industries, there emerges a disturbance factor that makes it so that prices are no longer directly proportional to labor times. However, we are going to see next what the actual implications of these are, which are not the implications that Unlearning Economics was trying to give. The next thing is that Unlearning Economics makes the point in his example that prices are not the same as labor values, and he presents this as if this were a criticism of the theory. But the truth is that no Marxist ever said that prices are the same as labor values. The actual proposition is that labor values are proportional to these prices, right? The prices are proportional to the labor values. Therefore, there must be a constant of proportionality between the two, and this one in the very simple exchange economy is given by the wage rate, but in capitalist economies, this constant of proportionality would obviously be more complicated. Now, let's take a look at how it is not true that profits are the ones that explain the disturbance factor in capitalist economies in the relationship of prices of production to labor values. So let's assume that organic compositions of capital are equal. In this case, okay, we could express competitive prices as the following equation, where the prices are equals to the labor values, that is the VI, times this very ugly looking expression that would be the constant of proportionality. Now in this example, where the organic compositions of capital are equal, even if you include profits, you will still get the analytical results that labor values are proportional to competitive prices. So therefore we can conclude first that prices and values are at least in principle measurable, which is something that we already showed earlier. Then that profits are not the source of the transformation problem, but actually the different organic compositions of capital that naturally arise in capitalist societies, and then also that the system is mathematically solvable, at least in some particular instances. But this isn't going to be the last thing that I'm going to say about the solvability of the mathematical system presented by the labor theory of value, since there are further developments that need to be discussed. But before doing that, first let's take a look at what the actual transformation problem really is, since Unlearning economics didn't really present it in a very comprehensive manner. So I'm going to be examining this problem by looking at the Shaikh-Smith decomposition of price. That is what I like to call this decomposition of price. And if you want to look at a more detailed explanation of this, you can look at my own paper on the labor theory of value, where I explain this entire procedure in more detail. So the basic argument is that starting from the premise that is the truism that profits are equal to the difference of revenues and costs, we can derive for any price the following expression. The expression is that the price is equal to the sum of the vertically integrated unit profits and the vertically integrated unit labor costs, where vertically integrated means that you are adding up both the direct and the indirect profits, okay, where the direct profits are the ones used in the actual production of the particular commodity, in this case commodity I, and the indirect ones are the ones that arise from the production of the commodities that are used up in the production of commodity I, right? And the same goes for the vertically integrated unit labor costs. Now in the case of competitive prices, that is prices of production, we're going to have the following expression. The price is going to be equal to the wage rate, the competitive wage rate, times the labor value of that industry, times 1 plus this particular thing that is the vertically integrated profit to wage ratio, where vertically integrated again means the same thing, right? That you are adding the direct and the indirect components of that particular ratio. Now the conclusion that we can derive from this particular expression is that if you take the relative prices of commodities, that is the relative price of commodity I to the relative price of commodity J, you will have an expression where you have the relative labor values times a disturbance factor, where this disturbance factor is basically the ratios of the vertically integrated profit to wage ratios, okay? Now, if the organic compositions of capital are equal across industries, and therefore the profit to wage ratios are equal across industries, then we would have that this, what we are going to call the disturbance factor, is going to be equal to 1, and this means that the prices are going to be directly proportional to the labor times. However, generally this factor, these relative profit to wage ratios are not going to be equal, and therefore the ratio is not going to be equal to 1. Therefore, we will have a disturbance factor. However, we can make the mathematical argument as to why this disturbance factor is going to be relatively close to 1. Meaning that labor values are still going to be the main determinants of competitive prices, so the system is not going to be fully cohesive, but at least is going to still yield the result that the labor values are going to be the main determinants of the competitive prices that are then going to explain the actual market prices. And this argument is basically of the form that since the profit to wage ratios are vertically integrated, their difference across industries is not going to be very large. That is, even if the direct profit to wage ratios between industries are very large, when you look at the vertical integrated profit to wage ratio of any given industry, you're looking at an average of the direct profit to wage ratio and all the other profit to wage ratios in the economy. So therefore, if you look at two series of vertical integrated profit to wage ratios, their dispersion is not going to be very large, even if the direct profit to wage ratios are very far apart from each other. And this is why we can make the argument that the disturbance factor is not going to be very large, and that is why labor values are still going to be the main determinants. So what we have seen is that the transformation problem is not about transforming values into prices, it is about transforming one form of value, which is the direct prices, that is the prices that are directly proportional to labor values, into a new set of prices, which are the prices of production, where there is going to be a disturbance factor, but this disturbance factor is going to be small enough for us to still consider labor values as the main determinants. So what the transformation problem is actually going to prove is that the relationship between classical labor values and competitive prices is going to feature a disturbance factor, but this doesn't invalidate the labor theory of value. Furthermore, there have been some recent developments on this subject that render the entire question about the deviation of competitive prices from labor values completely irrelevant. Now, this recent development was made by economist Ian Wright, and his basic argument is that in the classical labor theory of value, the disturbance factor arises because it only counts as labor costs the purely technical labor costs of production. However, he presents a more general labor theory of value that adds the extra social labor costs that are incurred in capitalist economies, that is the indirect labor costs that are given by the consumer goods that capitalist households are going to consume by advancing the money capital used in production. And if you add this extra labor, that is a social labor that is implied by the nature of capitalist economies, then you will get a different set of labor values, which is going to be equivalent to the classical, only that adding this extra social labor time, and these labor values are mathematically shown to be directly proportional to the competitive prices in a mathematical system. Therefore, the conclusion that Ian Wright derives from this, and this is why this is such an important development in this field, is that, as he says, this conclusion destroys the basis of any claim that the labor theory of value is logically incoherent, because prices and labor values are quantitatively incommensurable in linear production models. This means that the transformation problem gets completely dissolved under this new paradigm, and that now no accusation of inconsistency or mathematical insolvability can be raised against the labor theory of value. Finally, on this subject, I would like to make the point that obviously the transformation problem is not just limited to what I have discussed so far, and that there are many other things that have to be considered when talking about this issue. There are, for example, questions as to Marx's own transformation procedure and the necessity or lack thereof of feeding the effects of this transformation on the commodities considered as outputs, as them considered as inputs, and many other questions. But at a very basic level, this is exactly what the transformation problem is and what it shows, right? And the developments made by Ian Wright are certainly very, very important, and they show how the transformation problem under a new, more general labor theory of value gets completely dissolved. And the conclusions derived from the classical labor theory of value still remain in this new paradigm. So if you want to get a good understanding of this problem and its implications, I would recommend first and foremost that you read the papers by Anwar Shaikh and the papers by Ian Wright on this subject, and that from them you reach your own conclusions. The last point that Unlearning Economics makes before going into the empirical evidence is that actual economic actors in capitalist economies do not really care about the underlying labor values, and therefore he seems to be implying from this that the labor theory of value is wrong, since nobody in practice actually cares about the labor values. But the truth is that this is also a misrepresentation of the theory, since Marx himself knew that nobody really cared about the underlying labor values, and none of the premises of the labor theory of value are based on the idea that people should care about the underlying labor values. In fact, Marx's argument works not only in spite of, but precisely because nobody really cares about the labor values, right? The labor theory of value really is a theory about the unintended consequences of capitalist production and distribution. So we are not really basing our theory on some really silly premise about people really caring about this. So either Unlearning Economics' point is a misrepresentation, or it is completely irrelevant since it is already included in the theory. So now we turn to the empirical evidence on the labor theory of value. And on this subject, Unlearning Economics is again going to make very poor arguments that are going to need a very sophisticated discussion for us to understand why they are wrong and why there is much more to say on this subject than what Unlearning Economics actually said.
But what about the empirical evidence for the labor theory of value? If there's good empirical evidence, then surely there's something to the theory, even if we haven't fully ironed out all the kinks.
Paul Cockshott has produced graphs like this to try and prove the labor theory of value predicts prices in a given economic sector. On the x-axis, we have labor time measured by millions of full-time equivalent employees in a sector. Time spent laboring should be highly correlated with the value of labor. On the y-axis, we have value added in production in billions of dollars. Value added is dependent on sales and therefore prices. This seems to show a large correlation between the time spent in labor and the value produced. All hail the labor theory of value. The problem is that a correlation at the level of sectors of the economy does not guarantee values are correlated at the individual level.
This is known as the ecological fallacy. If you've watched my previous video on Jordan Peterson and gender discrimination, you'll know that I went over it in excruciating detail. Please don't make me do it again. Fine, let's do it again.
Cockshott's error is actually pretty simple. Birchler and Nitzan argue that the correlation can appear just because both the labour value and output are correlated with the size of a given sector. Here we have a spreadsheet they use to illustrate the problem. There are 20 sectors and each produces a different level of output. The level of output is higher as you go down the spreadsheet. Each sector also has a price for its type of output, and this is randomly generated between 1 and 10. Each sector also has a socially necessary value of labour that's required to produce its output, again, randomly generated between 1 and 10. But in this example, the prices and the labour values are generated independently, so they are not correlated. And you can see this clearly in graph 1, which plots them against each other and finds no relationship. Now, what Cockshott does is compares the total output of a sector to the total value of that output, which he measures in labour time. But both of these are obtained by multiplying price or value by output Q. So in this column we have Q times P, which is the total output in money terms, and in this column we have Q times V, which is the total output in value terms. Now what this does, multiplying by a common factor, is that it induces a spurious correlation. You have total price versus total value in graph 3, and you can see that there is indeed a correlation. You can also regenerate the prices and values, again completely independently of each other, and you find that for any values you will actually get a correlation. This is despite the fact that there is, by design, no relationship between labour value and price in this example.
Cockshott has replied to this, but I think he misses the key takeaway here. It's easy to get a correlation between labour time and value added using examples that do not feature the labour theory of value. There are a variety of historical factors which explain the value added in industries. These factors are likely to be correlated with the various measures of labour value used by people like Cockshott. For all you fans of... I've run out of charlatans. Steven Pinker? Didn't he write a new book called Rationality? Fuck's sake. For all you Steven Pinker fans out there, remember the tautology of assuming that prices represent values? It's back in statistical form. As the economist Blair Fix puts it,
suppose that in an effort to explain human height, I measure differences in skeletal length. I find a striking correlation between individuals' height and the length of their skeleton. I then claim to have explained human height.
Fix himself produces the correlation using something called the egalitarian heuristic, which I won't go into here, but you should check out his post on the matter if you want to learn more. Getting prices from values turns out to be something of a dead end. A bit like when they tried to remake Point Break. I don't know anything about films either. I think that's actually 2 overlapping repetition jokes now, both of them about 5 out of 10 in quality. Look, we have to forget about predicting prices. The transformation problem shows that predicting prices from values is just not possible. Empirical attempts to do so are doomed to fail.
So this seems to be what Unlearning Economics is telling us about empirical evidence on the labor theory of value. First of all, he presents it as if it were only formed by cross-sectional correlations between total values and total prices, right? Where total means that both the values and the prices are multiplied by the vector of industry outputs. And then he says that there is an ecological fallacy being made here, since the correlations at the level of industries do not mean that these correlations need to hold at the level of individual values and individual prices, right? So at a level of the industry, it may be true, but if you look at individual commodities within the industry, that particular correlation may not hold. Then he's telling us that the correlations are spurious, and he's giving us the very basic argument by Nitzan and Bichler, where if you take 2 vectors, of one of prices and another one of labor values, and you multiply them by the common vector of sector sizes, you will get a strong correlation between them, even though they were not originally correlated to begin with, right? And then he basically concludes from all of this that it is the transformation problem that shows that predicting prices from values is not possible, and that every single empirical attempt to do so is doomed to fail from the start. But of course, there are many problems with what Unlearning Economics just presented, and the basic problem is, again, the lack of analytical depth that Unlearning Economics is going to show in his argumentation on this matter. And then there's also another general argument, which is that there is actually no ecological fallacy being made here, since the industry level is the right level. And I'm going to discuss next what the implications of these are. But first, let's note that on the analytical depth side of his problem, we have 2 things to keep in mind. The first is that cross-sectional correlations, not only are they not the only source of evidence for the labor theory of value, but it's not even the best evidence that I think exists for the labor theory of value. The other one is that the cross-sectional correlations are actually not spurious, right? And the reason why they are not spurious is because for them to be spurious, you would first need to have a non-spurious correlation, right? A non-spurious correlation between values and prices, which is mathematically impossible since it violates dimensional analysis. And I discuss this with much more detail in this video that you can see in the screen, where I talk about this in detail and I show exactly why this is actually true. And then we also have to point out that labor values are indeed inherently correlated with the prices, whereas other inputs aren't. So this means that if it were true that this correlation is just spurious, we would see this correlation also in the same procedure applied to other commodities other than labor power. And we do not see this correlation. Therefore, it means that labor values are indeed inherently correlated to the prices. And I do make the argument that the outputs of industries add at least some type of explanatory power to the regression, which is why I do not prefer to use regression analysis for cross-sectional studies on the labor theory of value, and it is also why many other researchers have opted for other methods of analysis. But Unlearning Economics isn't going to present those other methods, and he's going to make it seem that the cross-sectional correlations are the only evidence, and he's going to wrongly claim that these are spurious. But as we just saw, they aren't spurious, and they are not even the best nor the only forms of evidence for the labor theory of value. And we are going to be discussing in particular the evidence that comes from measures of vector distance which do not, again, produce a spurious correlation problem. Then we're going to see correlations at the level of time series, so changes throughout time of prices and values, which also do not fall in the problem of having this spurious correlation issue. And then we're going to look also at the structural hypothesis. So we're going to look at 3 distinct pieces of evidence for the labor theory of value that do not rely on cross-sectional correlations and that Unlearning Economics completely omitted from his discussion. But first, let's consider the ecological fallacy argument, since at first I was under the impression that Unlearning Economics was actually accusing the labor theory of value of falling into this problem of being an ecological fallacy, but after speaking with him, I realized that he was actually just conflating the ecological fallacy with the accusation of spurious correlation. But even though he conflates these two, I would nevertheless like to make the case for why the labor theory of value doesn't fall into the ecological fallacy, since I know that some people do actually make this argument against the labor theory of value. So at a very basic level, the ecological fallacy is making statements about specific individuals within a population based on aggregate patterns observed at the population level. Right? So a very basic example of this would be to say that because men earn on average at the population level more than women, that it is impossible to find a woman that can earn more than any given man at an individual level. This would be an instance of the ecological fallacy, and the labor theory of value could indeed fall into the ecological fallacy if it claimed that for any given commodity, its labor value will determine its price, since we observe at the level of industries that labor values determine prices. This is not, however, what the labor theory of value claims, and this is not the interpretation that Marxists make from the data. Right? The actual interpretation is that the labor theory of value is a theory about representative commodities. That is, it is a theory about average commodities. So when we speak about the industry level, we are speaking about the right level at which to test the labor theory of value, right? Since the industry level is the industry where you can find the average measure, the average price for a commodity of some type, right? At the individual level, commodities could or could not follow some form of a labor theory of value, but at an industry level, which is the level at which this applies, and this is the very basic reason why we talk about socially necessary labor time, at this level, the labor theory of value works perfectly fine, both in theory and in practice in the empirical studies. And this form of argumentation shouldn't surprise anyone, because this is exactly how theories in the social sciences are made, right? When we speak, for example, about the gender wage gap, we are not speaking about it at an individual level. We're saying at a population level, it is true that men earn on average more than women. And the same goes therefore for the labor theory of value, which would basically state that if on average it takes twice the time to produce a mug than a pencil, then the mug will be on average twice as expensive as the pencil. And this is precisely what we do observe in the empirical studies. But now let's look at all of the other pieces of evidence that Unlearning Economics missed in his argument. The first is the measures of vector distance, which are done at a cross-sectional level. Now, instead of measuring how the labor values correlate with the prices, we can produce estimates of the theoretical labor-determined competitive prices, that is the competitive prices meaning the prices of production. We can estimate this based on the labor values, and we can see how close the direct prices or the prices of production are to the actual market prices, right? Using any vector distance measure that is adequate, such as, for example, I have here the mean absolute weighted deviation, which I used in my own paper, the mean absolute deviation, or the normalized vector distance, but there are many others that could work. And these prices of production, or the direct prices, can be calculated with input-output data. And there is a long list of studies in this field that report consistently small deviations between market prices and direct prices, and also between market prices and prices of production. So what we would have is a graph like the one here, where instead of a regression line, this is a 45-degree line, where if any given point is on the 45-degree line, it means that for that particular industry or that particular country, the direct price is exactly the same as the market price. Now, this graph, for example, is taken from this paper, which is one of the latest papers on this subject, that looks at a huge set of countries and a huge set of industries and still derives that the labor values are indeed the determinants of the competitive prices that explain the market prices. So this is just one of the latest papers that has been produced on this subject, but there are many other that I will of course link you in the description of the video. So here we have what I think is one of the most important pieces of evidence in favor of the labor theory of value, which cannot fall under the problem of spurious correlation since we are not doing regression analysis here, and shows consistently small deviations between labor times and prices, which means that the labor theory of value in practice is a good predictor of actual market prices. Then we also have the intertemporal hypothesis, or the intertemporal evidence in favor of the labor theory of value, where now what we want to do is see at the level of different points in time how the changes in prices correlate to the changes in labor values, right? So we want to make this particular comparison across time. And the labor theory of value, of course, predicts that changes in prices throughout time are going to be explained by changes in the labor values themselves. And in these particular regressions, the time series regressions, it is not going to be true that the industry outputs play a direct role, and therefore the spurious correlation argument, which said that it is the industry outputs that are explaining these high coefficients of correlation between the labor values and the prices, this argument cannot even be made in this particular instance. So what do we observe in the empirical studies done with this particular hypothesis? What we observe is that the changes in the ratios of prices to values correlate strongly across time periods, and this basically means that the labor theory of value is also explaining very nicely changes throughout time of these market prices. Finally, we have what is known as the structural hypothesis, which originates from Ricardo's own version of the transformation problem, which is known as the problem of the invariable measure of value, which basically suggests that we need an invariable measure of value, but in the classical labor theory of value, this doesn't really work because changes in profits do not change the underlying labor values, but they do change the prices, the competitive prices, since there is that extra degree of freedom that is added in the mathematical system of the labor theory of value with the classical labor values, as you remember from my previous discussion. However, Ricardo already was making the argument that the changes in profits tend to be offset by the changes in wages, and therefore the total effect on the prices is going to be small, keeping the labor values as the main determinants of the actual prices. And this was originally tested by a mathematician of a very famous mathematician that worked at NYU called Jacob Schwartz, and he very ingeniously used data across the peak and trough of business cycles where there are big changes in profits, wages, and output, but there aren't very big changes in the underlying labor values, to test how these changes will affect the actual market prices. And he reported only a 7% variation in relative prices, which meant that the structural element in the equation, as you remember, of prices, which is the labor values, is still the main determinant of these prices, and therefore this is evidence in favor of the labor theory of value coming from a different perspective. And this was also later tested by another economist, and he also produced very similar results to the ones by Jacob Schwartz. So in conclusion, we can make the claim that unlearning economics was mistaken in only presenting the cross-sectional correlations as the only piece of evidence in favor of the labor theory of value, not only because it is not the only, but also because it is wrong, and that there are three distinct hypotheses of the labor theory of value that can be tested without falling into a spurious correlation problem, and that still yield very good empirical results for the labor theory of value. So in the end, the conclusion is that the labor theory of value is good at predicting prices at a cross-sectional level and also at a time series level, right? At looking at the changes of prices throughout time. So now we turn to the section on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and on this subject, Unlearning economics makes the case that this tendency is proposed to apply at the level of the economy because Marxists had failed to explain prices at an individual level or even at an industry level. And this is, first of all, a way of presenting this argument in a very bad light, since it is not actually true that this is the reason why this theory applies at the level of the economy. It applies at the level of the economy because, according to the theory, it is an explanation of the aggregate patterns that we observe in profitability and the recurrent crisis of capitalist economies. But before we go into detail into the argument, let's look at how Unlearning economics explains this tendency of the rate of profit to fall.
One of Marx's key predictions concerned how sustainable capitalist profits would be. If we assume that only labour creates value, and make the further assumption that capitalists will tend to invest in labour-saving technology, then the volume of capital used in production will increase relative to the volume of labour. Capitalists will choose machines over labour to produce output more easily and efficiently. This means less surplus value because, remember, capital can't produce surplus value according to Marx. Less surplus value means less profit. The rate of profit in a capitalist economy will therefore decline over time. This means capitalism's ability to produce a surplus will wane, causing intermittent crises.
So the first thing is that Unlearning economics here is doing what we can call framing, because he is presenting the central fact of this theory that says that capitalists tend through time to invest more in constant capital than in variable capital. He presents this just as an assumption, when in reality this is a fact, and this is one of the most observed facts in the entire history of economics. And his argument goes as follows. First, he says that if we assume that the labor theory of value is true, and we assume also, although this is not an assumption, that capitalists invest in labor-saving technology, then there will be more constant capital than variable capital employed in production, and that this implies that there is going to be less surplus value throughout time, since constant capital cannot create surplus value. And therefore, this means, according to him, that there is going to be less profits throughout time, and that the less amounts of profit that are going to be occurring throughout time is going to explain the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And this explanation is fundamentally mistaken. Now, I know that Unlearning economics was trying to simplify a more complicated argument, but in doing this, he missed the basic point of the argument. And this is basically a better simplification of the argument that I'm going to present here. So we first start with the fact that capitalists tend to invest more in labor-saving technology throughout time, right? And we know this to be the case because it is a fundamental part of how capitalist competition works in practice, right? Capitalists invest more in labor-saving technologies in order to be able to produce output more efficiently, and in order to reduce the unit price at which they sell that output, so that they can outcompete each other in the competitive struggle of capitalist economies. Then we go to the question of how the growth of the profit rate and of the organic composition of capital goes throughout time. And if we accept that first fact, then we have to conclude that throughout time, the composition of capital, that is the ratio of constant capital to variable capital, is also going to grow throughout time. And we also note that the long-term trend of the profit rate at the aggregate level is dominated by the inverse growth rate of the composition of capital, which means that if the composition of capital tends to grow throughout time, the long-term trend of the profit rate is going to be a trend that decreases throughout time. And the basic conclusion that is drawn from these two things is that the rate of profit will decrease throughout time, and that this can happen even if the rate of surplus value grows very fast, right? The implication here is therefore that there could be more exploitation going on, and this is what makes the argument so important and so unique, right? That exploitation could actually be growing, whereas the underlying tendency of the rate of profit will be to decline. And then this decreasing tendency of the rate of profit will affect the total mass of profits, thereby bringing long waves in the mass of profits that are then going to explain the recurrent crisis. And here I would recommend that you read this paper by Anwar Shaikh, where he explains this in much more detail and where he takes a look at some evidence in favor of this proposition. So I just want to make the point more clear about the relationship of the rate of profit to the mass of profit, because Unlearning economics was making it seem like it is the declining mass of profits due to the incapability of constant capital to create surplus value that explains the falling rate of profit, when in reality it is the falling rate of profits that explain the movements that we can observe in the total mass of profit. And this is what Anwar Shaikh in this paper that I linked basically postulates as the theory, okay? He says, a secularly falling rate of profit necessarily produces a long wave in the basic mass of profit, which first accelerates, then decelerates, stagnates, and even falls. And then this basic mass of profit can be restored, so the rate of profit can then, with counteracting tendencies, raise back again to restore the mass of profit, but in any case it is the rate of profit that is driving these particular features in the mass of profits. And this is the basis for a broader theory of business cycles. And at this juncture in the video, you may be thinking to yourself, well, if Unlearning economics hasn't represented correctly the subjective theory of value, he hasn't represented correctly the labor theory of value, he hasn't represented correctly the empirical evidence for the labor theory of value, he hasn't represented correctly the transformation problem, and hasn't even represented correctly the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, how can we trust that he will represent correctly the empirical evidence on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and the potential falsifiability and scientificity of this theory? Well, you are right in noting that, because again, what he's going to do next is misrepresent these positions once again. And although he doesn't seem to have any criticisms of the theory, he does have a lot to say about the empirical evidence and the potential falsifiability of this theory. And the first concrete thing that he says about this is that, well, visual inspection of time series graphs on the rate of profit is not good evidence in favor or against the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and nevertheless, even though he claims this, that visual inspections are not good evidence, he is then going to present a visual inspection of very simple estimates of the rate of profit that he made using Fred data to claim that it is non-obvious that these rates of profit are falling. So he is doing, in the first instance, a claim about the non-validity of simple visual inspections to prove a point, an econometric point, and then he's going to use that particular form of evidence to make the case that this theory is non-obvious. Not only is he doing this, which is a very direct contradiction, but also he seems to be implying with this point that in order for a theory to be good, in order for an economic theory to be empirically sound, it must be obvious in the data. Regardless of which data set you're looking at, the theory must just show itself very clearly and completely to you almost immediately. And I am going to argue that this is obviously not true, since this would basically invalidate all of economic research, because economic researchers, their job is primarily to look at hidden patterns in the data and to be able to use complicated theories to explain non-obvious things. And a very famous example is the Nobel Prize that Claudia Golding earned last year with her research on inequalities related to gender. And her research is obviously not founded on very obvious things that anybody looking at the data could immediately point out, regardless of the data set or regardless of whatever tools you use. Indeed, her research was focused on looking at many different points of data and at analyzing unobserved phenomena that are not immediately observable, and this is precisely why her research was so popular and it was so good. Unlearning economics is then going to make a point about the potential falsifiability of the theory. Let's hear it.
Now, Marx knew that the rate of profit wouldn't always fall. He identified countervailing tendencies: growing populations, increased exploitation of labor, cheap imports. all could increase the rate of profit, at least in the short term. My concern is that these countervailing tendencies can render the theory unfalsifiable. If you're not convinced, then consider this argument. Suppose I stated that there was a tendency for the rate of profit to rise. If you check the graphs from before, some of them do kind of show it rising. You could then point to some data showing that it has fallen or stayed the same, at least in certain time periods. But then I could say, well, those are countervailing tendencies. What would you think? What then would be the use of my theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to rise?
Now, Unlearning Economics is correct in pointing out that for Marx and for many other Marxist theorists, the rate of profit is not going to always be decreasing, and that this is going to be a very steady decline. The point is that there are obviously counteracting tendencies that are going to make it so that this is more of a tendency rather than a thing that occurs at all points in time, everywhere, regardless of whatever the circumstances are in that particular historical moment. But then he's going to claim that these counteracting tendencies could render the theory unfalsifiable. And I agree with him on this, so the concern that he seems to be presenting is a valid concern, since it is true that many people could use these counteracting tendencies to render the theory completely unfalsifiable, since you could basically explain any patterns in the data just by saying that it is some magical counteracting tendencies that are producing them. However, he is conflating this weak position on him just being concerned about the potential falsifiability of the theory with his stronger position that he's going to present later in the video about the theory being completely unfalsifiable. So notice how this is a Mott and Bailey fallacy, where he is presenting this, I'm just concerned about the potential falsifiability, and then without any other supporting evidence, he's going to suggest that it is indeed unfalsifiable.
The TRPF becomes more like a lens through which Marxists view the world. It's unfalsifiable, something acknowledged explicitly by some authors. Whatever happens to the rate of profit is interpreted through Marx's categories of surplus labor and exploitation and the organic composition of capital.
And again, here I would agree with him if the counteracting tendencies were being used in a way that renders the theory unfalsifiable. However, Marx presented concrete and testable counteracting tendencies that are in no shape or form simply magical things that could make the data go in one way or another, and we don't have really any reasons other than some magical, mystical counteracting tendencies. In fact, as Unlearning Economics shows next, there is indeed empirical research done that accounts for these counteracting tendencies. Therefore, maybe Unlearning Economics could make the case that the evidence is not yet good enough for him to believe in this theory, but he could not claim that the theory is unfalsifiable, because even he has presented a paper that tests the theory using the specific counteracting tendencies outlined by Marx himself. But before going into the empirical evidence, let me first make the case for why theoretically this theory is actually falsifiable, so it is scientific in this sense, by making an analogy with a hypothesis drawn from gravity theory. So, as I was discussing earlier, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is a hypothesis that throughout time the rate of profit will tend to fall. Okay, very simple. But however, there are counteracting tendencies that make it so that at certain points in time, or maybe all throughout time, there will be factors that are pushing this rate of profit upward, even though its natural tendency is to decline. So valid tests of this theory could explicitly account for these counteracting tendencies, or maybe they could omit the counteracting tendencies, right? So if we see evidence of a falling rate of profit without explicitly accounting for the counteracting tendencies, we could take that to be good enough evidence for the theory. However, if we do not observe the rate of profit immediately or throughout time falling, we could indeed try to account for the counteracting tendencies to see if the pattern that we observe is hiding, because of the counteracting tendencies, the underlying tendency of the rate of profit, right? So in principle, this theory is falsifiable. And this is very similar to the hypothesis of gravity theory that suggests that two objects free fall at the same rate, right? So if you take any two objects, irregardless of their mass, they should free fall at the same rate. However, this theory also suggests that there are counteracting tendencies, the most important one being air resistance, that make it so that in practice, two objects may not free fall at the same time due to these counteracting tendencies. So valid tests for this particular hypothesis could either account explicitly for these counteracting tendencies by, for example, doing the experiment in a vacuum where there isn't any air resistance or the air resistance is minimized, or we could make some type of test without explicitly accounting for these counteracting tendencies that could produce a result very similar to the one we hypothesize, and this could be taken to be good enough evidence for the theory. Of course, the more rigorous test will account explicitly for the counteracting tendencies, but even if in the data, without accounting for it, we don't observe this pattern, we cannot obviously say that the theory is not sound, and if we do observe that pattern in the data, we can take it to be a decent indication that this pattern could indeed be happening. So therefore, we have established that at least in principle, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is falsifiable. And furthermore, a more rigorous test will take into account the counteracting tendencies, but if we observe the rate of profit falling without explicitly accounting for the counteracting tendencies, that could be also taken to be good enough evidence for the theory. So it seems to me that when Unlearning Economics is presenting this idea that the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is unfalsifiable, he is basically saying that in order for him to believe at least that it is falsifiable, he would need to see an empirical analysis of this tendency that accounts explicitly for these counteracting tendencies that may render the theory unscientific. So it would then make sense to believe that if he were shown an empirical study where these counteracting tendencies are explicitly accounted for, that at least he will be able to say that this theory is falsifiable. However, this is not even the case, because coming next, he's going to talk about an empirical paper by Basu and Manolakos, where they do in fact do this empirical procedure of accounting for counteracting tendencies, and nevertheless he is still going to conclude that the theory is unfalsifiable. So again, he could say that this evidence is not good enough for him, but he would be unjustified in claiming that it is unfalsifiable, since even with his own standards in mind, this theory is falsifiable. So what it seems to be happening here is that his own proposition that the theory is unfalsifiable is itself unfalsifiable, because regardless of the evidence that he's presented with, he's still going to conclude that basic thing that is completely false. And when it comes to the Basu and Manolakos paper, which you have in the screen right now, Unlearning Economics makes the claim that this evidence is not good enough. First of all, because the authors themselves call the tendency that they observe in the data as a weak negative tendency of the rate of profit, and also because there need to be many more papers to be produced in order for him to believe that this hypothesis is actually true. However, there are two things to keep in mind here. First of all, I believe that focusing only on the word weak that Basu and Manolakos used to describe their finding isn't really completely capturing the nature of what these authors believe their findings to be, since they do take this finding, although it is a small decline throughout time, accounting for counteracting tendencies, but they nevertheless still take this evidence to suggest the existence of this falling rate of profit throughout time, even under the proposition where we account for the counteracting tendencies. So even if it's not a lot of empirical research that does this, and I certainly agree with Unlearning Economics on this, and I certainly believe that more empirical research is needed, we can still see that there is something there that we are looking at, and this tendency is negative and it is statistically significant. So at least we have to contend with this evidence, and we need to say that there seems to be something going on. Further empirical research is required, but we cannot, as Unlearning Economics does, simply dismiss this evidence because the authors themselves say that it is a small negative tendency, or because it's just one paper. The evidence is there, it is statistically significant, and we still have to account for it. Furthermore, I also believe that we can take all the other empirical papers that do not necessarily account for counteracting tendencies, but nevertheless show this decline, this tendential decline in the rate of profit throughout time, to be good indicators of the theory that, in conjunction with the paper by Basu and Manolakos, should give us an impression that there is indeed something going on. But none of the evidence that we can present in favor of the falling rate of profit will even convince Unlearning economics, since he believes that these patterns in the data can just simply be explained by specific historical events that are not related at all to underlying, to more, let's say, tendential patterns in capitalist economies. And this seems to me to be another argument from ignorance. This time what he's saying is, well, I cannot think of any good reason as to why historical events couldn't explain this general tendency, therefore I'm going to assume that this is just due to specific historical events. But the truth is that in our theory we do account for specific historical events. In fact, specific historical events in the theory of business cycles of the classical economists and Marx play an especially important role, since they are the particular expressions of the more general and underlying patterns of the functioning of capitalist economies. As Anwar Shaikh explains, capitalist accumulation is a turbulent dynamic process. It has powerful built-in rhythms modulated by conjunctural factors and by specific events. Analysis of the concrete history of accumulation must therefore distinguish between intrinsic patterns and their particular historical expressions. Capitalist history is always enacted upon a moving stage. So what we can see here is that we do take into account these particular historical events, and we take them into account in their historical context and with their specific importance. Nevertheless, this doesn't deny the existence of an underlying tendency, and this is precisely what we are trying to uncover with this theory and what the evidence seems to be pointing to, even though there is still a lot of empirical research to be done on this particular subject. So finally, we have arrived at the section that asks this very basic question of whether we do indeed need theories of value or we don't. And here Unlearning economics makes the case that although we haven't found a good theory of value, that we should nevertheless still try to find one, since this is our best chance at getting to an actual understanding of how these messy capitalist economies work. And here he seems to be hinting at the potential validity of the theory of value presented by Petty. However, what he's missing is that Petty was already taken into account by the classical economists and especially by Marx, and there is this paper, for example, that suggests that Petty's own arguments had an influence on Marx's theories. So we can clearly see how the Marxist labor theory of value is already a better and more developed version of the arguments of Petty that here Unlearning economics is hinting at. And I do not believe that we haven't found a good theory of value. Indeed, I think that Unlearning economics here hasn't even presented good reasons as to why the subjective theory of value or the labor theory of value are bad theories to begin with. So what I would like to say on this final note is that we have indeed a really good theory of value that is not only theoretically very valid and sound, but also has a lot of empirical evidence in its support, which is the labor theory of value, and that all of the developments that are to be made on this subject have to be at least grounded at some level on this notion of labor value. For example, if we begin to talk about the influence of artificial intelligence on this question, and we then ask the question of whether we should add artificial intelligence labor to the total equations on labor values, this would of course be premised upon a more basic theory of value based on labor value. And this is what I would like to conclude in this video, which is that Unlearning economics hasn't really presented any good reasons as to why we should not believe in the labor theory of value, and therefore you should not be discouraged to continue researching the labor theory of value and to continue improving upon what we already have. Other theories based on other sources of economic value could still be proposed and may even be better than the labor theory of value. But before we go there, we first have to contend with what we already have, which is a very solid foundation that I don't think can be easily gotten rid of by arguments or non-arguments of the kinds that Unlearning Economics has presented here. So I also encourage you to keep studying this, and I am myself also going to keep studying this for the rest of my life, and I encourage you to look at all of the places that you can to continue working on what we already have, but keeping in mind that there have been already very good developments made on these theories. Given the fact that all of the papers that I have cited in this video come from different sources and have different arguments, I am going to compile all of them in a single document that I will link to you in the description instead of linking all of the sources directly, so that it's more organized and you have a better place to look at. And if you have any questions about any of the papers, if you have any questions about any of the arguments, you are always free to ask me. You are always free to start these conversations. And with this video, my main intention is also to further the conversation that Unlearning Economics started and to get us going into more advanced discussions on these issues than the one that Unlearning Economics had presented in his video. Finally, I would really like to thank you for having watched this video. And if you have an interest in the content that I produce and would like to support me with whatever means you are capable of, that I would also really appreciate that. And yes, having said all of that, I will see you in the next video.